sound of a creaking door opening, followed by a low, ominous hum. Welcome back to Tales from the Dark Room. Gather close and try to ignore the shadows that dance just at the edge of your vision. Tonight, we delve into a story that begins with innocent charm and ends in unspeakable dread. We bring you the terrifying tale of the Labubu Doll, a curse that whispers, hunts, and consumes. It all started with a gift, a seemingly harmless collectible for a young woman named Clara. She was an avid collector, and the latest addition to her shelf was a limited edition Labubu, with its mischievous grin and long, floppy ears. She named him Pip. Little did she know, Pip had a story of his own, one written in fear and silence. The first week was uneventful. Pip sat among the other figures, just another plastic face in the crowd. But then, the nights began to change. It started with a whisper, so faint Clara thought it was the wind or the old house settling. A soft, sibilant sound, like a secret being shared just for her. She would sit up in bed, straining her ears, but there was only silence. Then, a few nights later, it happened again. This time it was clearer, a single, drawn-out word that sounded like her name, Clara, spoken by a child's voice. She checked the locks, peered out the windows, and found nothing. She dismissed it as exhaustion, the product of a stressed mind. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more insistent. They twisted from simple sounds into fragmented sentences, phrases that made no sense but chilled her to the bone. "He's watching," they would hiss. "Can't you see him?" The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were a presence. They followed her from room to room, a constant, unnerving chorus that the day's light could not erase. Soon the whispers started to change in tone. The childlike quality warped, becoming guttural, angry. The soft hissing became strained screams that would jolt her awake at night, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She would lie in the dark, drenched in a cold sweat, listening to the phantom shrieks echo in her mind long after they had faded. The house, once her sanctuary, had become a prison of sound. Sleep offered no escape. In fact, it was worse. The nightmares began, vivid and terrifyingly real. Every night, she found herself in a decaying grey room, the walls weeping with a strange, dark substance. And in that room were children, dozens of them. They were gaunt and pale, with hollow, empty eyes that stared right through her. Their faces were emotionless, their movements slow and listless. But the most horrifying detail was what each of them clutched in their hands, a Labubu doll, identical to Pip. They held them tightly, as if for comfort, yet their blank expressions suggested only despair. In her dreams, the children would turn to her in unison, their heads tilting at an unnatural angle. They wouldn't speak, but a collective thought would flood her mind, a wave of pure, undiluted terror. "He made us," the thought would scream. "Now you're one of us." She would see herself among them, her own eyes becoming hollow, her own hands reaching for a doll that was waiting just for her. She would wake up gasping. The image of those hollow-eyed children burned into her memory. She started to fear falling asleep, chugging coffee and energy drinks to stay awake. But exhaustion always won. The nightmares became her new reality, a nightly pilgrimage to that grey, hopeless room. The doll's malevolent influence began to bleed from the ethereal world into the physical one. Strange and dangerous accidents started happening around the house with alarming frequency. One afternoon, as Clara was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, the knife block on the counter suddenly tipped over. A heavy chef's knife skittered across the surface and plunged downwards, embedding itself in the floorboards just an inch from her foot. Her heart leaped into her throat. She stared at the knife, then at the block, trying to understand how it could have fallen. It had been stable, untouched. Later that week, she was washing her face in the bathroom when a loud crack echoed through the small space. She looked up to see a jagged fracture running across the mirror, starting from the corner and splintering towards her reflection. It looked as if something had struck it with immense force, yet she was alone. Doors would slam shut with violent force, even on windless days, trapping her in rooms until the handle would mysteriously turn on its own. The house was actively turning against her, orchestrated by an unseen hand. She began to feel like a trespasser in her own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next accident. Each incident chipped away at her sanity, leaving her a nervous wreck. The most unnerving part was that after each event she would glance towards the shelf where the Labubu doll sat, and she could have sworn its painted smile seemed wider, more triumphant. As her fear intensified, Clara started noticing something else, something deeply unsettling about the room where she kept her collection. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own. In the evenings, as the sun went down, the corner where Pip sat would plunge into a darkness that seemed deeper and more absolute than anywhere else in the house. It was a thick, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light. She would watch, mesmerized and horrified, as the shadows writhed and stretched. They would creep along the walls, elongating into grotesque humanoid shapes with long, grasping fingers. Sometimes they would form the silhouette of a small figure, one that looked disturbingly like the Labubu doll, but grown to human size. It would stand perfectly still in the corner, a void in the shape of a monster just watching her. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light, her overactive imagination playing on her fears. She bought brighter lamps, kept every light in the house on, but it made no difference. The shadows in that corner remained, a pocket of living darkness. She realized with a dawning horror that the doll wasn't just sitting on the shelf. It was commanding the very darkness of the room, using it as its own personal army of specters. Pip was no longer just a doll, he was a king on a throne of shadows. Clara knew she had to get rid of it. Her mind, though frayed and terrified, screamed at her to destroy the source of this nightmare. One night, fueled by a desperate surge of courage, she grabbed a heavy hammer from the garage. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was firm. She marched into the room, her eyes fixed on the smug, smiling face of the Labubu doll. The shadows in the corner recoiled as she approached, hissing and shrinking back as if afraid of her intent. She reached for the doll, her fingers closing around its cold, plastic body. It felt heavier than it should, dense with a malevolent energy. She raised the hammer high above her head, ready to bring it down and shatter this curse into 1,000 pieces. But as she brought it down, an unseen force slammed into her. She was thrown backward, hitting the opposite wall with a sickening thud. The hammer clattered to the floor. A child's laughter, cold and cruel, filled the room, coming from all directions at once. The shadows surged forward, enveloping her, their cold touch like spiders crawling on her skin. She was paralyzed, pinned by an invisible weight, forced to stare at the doll, which sat completely unscathed on its shelf, its grin wider and more mocking than ever. The attempt had failed. The entity was too strong. She hadn't been trying to destroy a toy, she had been trying to fight a demon, and she had lost. Defeated and broken, Clara stumbled through the next few days in a fog of despair. The whispers were constant now, a cacophony of taunts and threats inside her head. The accidents grew more malicious, and the nightmares became indistinguishable from reality. She had given up. She was simply waiting for the end. One evening, she found herself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, the same one that had cracked days earlier. She stared at her reflection, hardly recognizing the person looking back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide with a permanent look of fear, dark circles like bruises beneath them. She was a ghost of her former self. As she stared, something began to change. Her reflection's expression slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to shift. The terror in its eyes faded, replaced by a cold, empty amusement. The corners of her reflection's mouth began to twitch, curling upwards. It was a slow, deliberate, and utterly horrifying transformation. The mouth in the mirror stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, a perfect painted-on smile that mimicked the Labubu doll's. Her own face remained frozen in horror, but the woman in the mirror, the other her, was smiling that terrible, evil smile. The eyes of her reflection were no longer her own. They were black, vacant pits, just like the hollow-eyed children from her nightmares. The curse was complete. It hadn't just haunted her house, it had invaded her very being. She was the doll now, and the doll was her. The whispers finally stopped. There was only a single, silent, triumphant grin staring back from the glass. This has been Tales from the Dark Room. If you ever find a charming new toy that seems too good to be true, Or if you hear whispers in the dead of night, remember Clara's story. Remember that some smiles hide the darkest of intentions. And whatever you do, keep the lights on. Until next time, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this tale of terror, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the dark. Stay safe.